And for those that just joined, welcome. You probably just heard the warning. We are recording this so that we can then share it back out with you, and you can share it with friends and colleagues because we're really excited about this presentation tonight. Um, we got somebody joining us all the way from Arizona talking about habitat connectivity and wildlife. So this is a real treat. Um, We'll give it just another minute or so. We're just now at 6:30, but I hope everybody's doing well. A little bit of break from the extreme heat we've been experiencing. It's a nice little break. Hopefully, we'll get a little bit more rain that we're in dire need of. All right. Well, it's 6:31, and I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Give me 1 second. Brennan and Nick, can y'all ensure me that you can see my slides okay? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, cool. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Trapper Fowler. I'm your Habitat Connectivity Director here at Wild, Virginia. And tonight, again, like I said, we're lucky to have Wildlife Program Manager Eamon Harrity with us, speaking to us about Sky Island Alliance's border wall wildlife study and some of their efforts along the U.S.-Mexico border. Eamon, thanks for joining us tonight. I've enjoyed just picking your brain and reminiscing on my time spent in Arizona. Share with the group here. Arizona was one of my first wildlife jobs. And, that was my first experience in the Southwest as a young wildlife biologist at the time, studying wildlife biology at the time, not even a biologist yet. But yeah, I was stationed not too far away from where Eamon is in Tucson, up on Mount Graham, conducting surveys for Mount Graham red squirrels, which is endemic to the top of that mountain, which is really neat, and then Mexican spotted owls and talus snails. So it was really exciting summer, amazing ecosystem to explore and work in, and hopefully I can get back out there. That was a long time ago. Um, so just want to again remind everyone, this is being recorded. I want to cover some housekeeping items. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We will ask you to put any questions. You're more than welcome to enter those as we go. We won't stop Eamon as he presents, but feel free to go ahead and put your questions as they come to you in the Q&A box, not the chat if you don't mind. And then at the very end, our lovely interns, Bryn and Nick, will help field those questions with the time that we have allowed. So want to thank them too for joining us tonight and helping out with the webinar. Don't be shy to put questions in the chat because we can all learn from your questions. There are no bad questions. And again, you will receive a follow-up email. I'll try to get with Eamon to provide any follow-up materials, links to anything he discusses, and to help you further learn about what all they have going on in Arizona. But yeah, don't hesitate to share this great information with friends and colleagues. So in addition to our habitat connectivity program, in which I help Wild Virginia manage, we also have our water quality program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and that's led by Mr. David Sly. So please be sure to tune into some of those upcoming program events and advocacy engagement opportunities. Um, Again, thanks to the interns to helping us out this evening, and wanted to share that this is a good link with some contact information. while Virginia can't do this important work, this habitat connectivity work and water quality protections work without your help, we get our energy from you all and the energy to keep, pushing for better wildlife habitat connectivity, policy and programs and infrastructure and our water quality protections. So consider supporting us, whether that's through donations or just helping to advocate. We need help in both of those avenues and ensuring that everyone can help in their own way. But we can't do this work without you all. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Mr. Eamon Harrity. He's the Wildlife Program Manager for Sky Island Alliance in Tucson, Arizona. Eamon completed his undergraduate degree in environmental sciences at the University of Vermont in 2011. He completed his master's degree on the migration behaviors of endangered marsh species of bird at the University of Idaho in 2019. And outside of work, Eamon enjoys birding and riding bikes, and I hear that. I do too. Tonight, we'll hear from him about his organization, Sky Island Alliance, and how they've used wildlife cameras to evaluate the ability of species to navigate border barriers and the impacts of these barriers on habitat connectivity there in the Southwest. So, this is just another contact page if you need to get in contact with us. Um, but I will go ahead and hand it over to our speaker. Eamon, if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and I will stop sharing mine, and you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Trapper, and for inviting me to speak with you all today. I'm excited to talk about some of the work we do in southeastern Arizona and northern Mexico. Again, I'm Eamon Harrity, coming to you from Tucson, Arizona, talking to you about border walls. So, Sky Island Alliance is a nonprofit, much like Wild Virginia, been around for a little more than 3 decades, focused on the conservations of the lands and waters of the southwestern corner of New Mexico, southeastern corner of Arizona, and then northern Sonora and a little bit of Chihuahua. Basically, what we call the Madrean Sky Islands. And I like to start with some context. I'm often talking to folks in the Southwest where the term is a little bit more familiar, but I'd love to ask the question of just who has heard the term of Sky Islands. I know we can't actually do an interactive Q&A, but maybe you can mention in the chat if you've heard the term. But it's an evocative term, right? It was coined by a natural historian who was living and working in the region, and it speaks to these mountains that erupt from the low elevational habitats in our system. That's like desert grasslands, desert scrub with your cactus and your choyas and your ocotillos. And they go straight up into the sky, creating a habitat gradient, elevational gradients, increased moisture, different habitats, so that you have species that can exist down here that wouldn't otherwise occur at this latitude. Chapper and I were talking earlier about his summer in Mount Graham, where he arrived in May. It's hot. It's summer in the Southwest, but by the time he got to the mountain tops, it was snowing. And that's kind of typical of these sky islands, where if you drive from Tucson, for example, to the top of the nearest mountain range, it's the equivalent of driving from the US-Mexico border to the US-Canada border, and it only takes an hour. And what makes this different from a normal mountain where we often see this kind of gradient of habitat is that each mountain is completely isolated from its neighbors by this low land habitat. Again, in our area, that's desert scrub, desert grassland. So much like an island in the sea, plants and animals at the higher elevations on these mountains are kind of isolated from their neighbors. What this means is that there's a lot of space and a lot of niches for diversity. When you add the context of the region, where we're kind of nestled between the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert. We actually straddle these 55 mountains that make up the Madre and Sky Islands. They span the gap between the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Madre Mountains, which are these massive mountain chains that span the continent and go from North America to South America. When you add all this together, it turns out the Sky Islands are one of the most biologically diverse places in North America. We have saguaro cactus and aspen. We have pronghorn and ocelot. We have black bears and jaguars. For birders, we have bald eagles and greyhawks, American robins and elegant trogons. I mean, it's just one of the most biologically unique places in North America. Just for some highlights, 114 mammal species, lots of reptiles, unknown, kind of uncountable numbers of plants. Current estimate is about 4,000 plant species. And over half the bird species in North America have been seen in the Sky Islands. Truly a special place, worth a visit. I encourage anyone to come out who hasn't been here yet. But it's also at the confluence of countries, right? It's split right down the middle by the US-Mexico border. And over the past 2 decades, really, we've seen an unprecedented explosion or expansion of border infrastructure designed to control the flow of immigration. It all, there's a long history, but it really started to speed up in 2005 and 2006 with a couple pieces of legislation. The Real ID Act of 2005, the Secure Fences Act of 2006 set the stage for really rapid proliferation of border infrastructure. This photo is looking east from Arizona, and that mountain range in the distance in the sun is in Chihuahua or, south of New Mexico. But this is the border wall looking east, where this map puts into greater context the current status of border walls and infrastructure in New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Really, the status is from 2005. Things are rapidly changing, so we'll see this map again. But in red, we have what we know as pedestrian barrier. This is typically a wall like you see in the top right, which has steel posts about 30 feet tall. Sometimes they're 18 feet, but primarily 30 feet. And there's, as you can see in this map, there's lots and lots of miles, many, many hundreds of miles of pedestrian wall currently along the border. An older, more antiquated style is the vehicle barrier on the lower left. This is variable structure made out of recycled railroad rails, designed to slow the movement of vehicles, but not really intended to stop the flow of pedestrian traffic. So on the map, that's represented in blue. And then in places where there's just the little dashed gray line, that means there's nothing there except barbed wire. There's usually barbed wire. Some very few places there's not barbed wire because there's a lot of cows. Basically, currently, or as of 2025, more than 70% of the borders of the Arizona, New Mexico, and California had pedestrian wall, and closer to more than 90% had some form of infrastructure, either vehicle barrier or border wall. And it is not a gentle process, right? It's a violent, expedited process to build these border walls that literally move mountains or create mountains. Those legislation pieces I mentioned earlier give the Department of Homeland Security the authority to waive all laws and regulations, full stop. To date, ends up being about 84 laws and regulations have been ignored. These are kind of foundational to the conservation movements, like the Endangered Species Act, Clean Water, Clean Air Act. Also, really importantly, it's laws around the protecting of cultural and historical resources. So archaeological sites are bulldozed, historic sites are bulldozed. Nothing quite matters because of those pieces of legislation that were put in place in 2005 and 2006. This is a photo looking south from not far from Nogales, Arizona. And if you look at this, where my cursor is, this is the true US-Mexico border. And that little obelisk is a little kind of cement structure that marks the true border. And that's all that was in place for many, many decades, were just these spaced out obelisk or boundary markers. And then came barbed wire fence, and then came, in some places, vehicle barrier. And then the final iteration is this pedestrian wall we see here. So, like I said, they kind of create and bulldoze mountains. They dam and block rivers. This is the San Pedro River, just south and east of us here in Tucson. This is considered the last free-flowing river, undammed river in the Southwest. This was dammed by Border Wall in 2020. This is another free-flowing river near Tucson, Arizona, where they are damming this up with Border Wall, and this was taken just a couple months ago. Looking west, again, border walls are taking over a lot of the continent. And because the many laws and regulations are waived, there's no environmental impact statements or assessments completed before, during, or after construction. So there's really a lack of understanding what are the impacts of border wall. And just for context, the spacing between those bollards is at most 4.5 inches. So we're talking about a border wall that's almost splitting a continent, where anything larger than 4 inches across at the shoulders or at the head can't get through. So we asked a relatively simple question of just how do animals navigate border infrastructure? What do they do when they encounter these barriers? We use wildlife cameras. I'm sure folks are familiar with these. These are motion activated cameras, popular with both hunters and recreationists, and increasingly with conservation and research groups that use cameras to detect all manner of things. We have placed these cameras for the past 6 years across about 140 miles of the US-Mexico border. That's more than 100,000 detections at this point of mammals, not to mention all the hundreds of thousands of photos of birds, reptiles, insects, and other creatures. But anyone who's worked with cameras knows that 100,000 detections means millions and millions and millions of photos or videos, because they take a lot of empty images. So we have a team of volunteers and interns who help us both in person in Tucson, but also remotely review and turn the media, the photos and videos, into data that we can use to tell the story of the border. For today, we're going to focus on 20 terrestrial, or primarily terrestrial, species that range in size from the ringtail, which is a small nocturnal animal related to raccoons. They're about 2 pounds, all the way on up to the American black bear. This is the largest species in our region that may be impacted by the border wall. But some of the other animals we considered are things like gray foxes, mule deer, white-tailed deer, mountain lion, North American porcupine. Surprisingly, we have a pretty good population down here. We have collared peccary or javelina, 4 different species of skunk. And then you'll notice here I have the wild turkey, which, yes, it has wings, but folks who have worked with turkeys or have experienced turkeys flying, not necessarily the first thing they're going to do, not their strongest talent. And so the border wall, we reason the border wall might still be a barrier to these animals. If we start with the context of what's the minimum infrastructure most of these creatures are going to encounter, especially in our region, that's this combination vehicle barrier, barbed wire fence. That's, like I mentioned earlier, a variable structure. Typically, this is sort of a basic framework with some cross support beams and then a horizontal bar. And that's shown in blue on the map. Our cameras told a story where here we see a mountain lion followed by 2 large kittens, or basically adults at this point, but they're moving freely. This is a camera looking east, and just off screen on the left is the vehicle barrier. So they've ducked under the vehicle barrier and are now moving under that barbed wire fence into Sonora. And this is kind of unusual to see 3 mountain lions together. So we've reasoned, and we've seen other videos of this family group, that it's an adult female with 2 really old offspring. But again, moving relatively freely through this infrastructure. And across all species, again, this photo shows a mountain lion here in the lower left. When an animal encountered a vehicle barrier, they're crossing in more than 50% of the occasions. We will talk about crossing rates today. And what that means simply is, if we had 10 observations of a mountain lion, say, at a vehicle barrier, and in 5 of those observations it managed to get through, we would call that a crossing rate of 50%. So I'll return to this kind of term, crossing rates, and that's basically how they're calculated. But across those 20 species we evaluated, most of them, all of them are moving fairly freely through this structure, which is what more or less what we expected, but it was nice to have that confirmation. The story at border walls is much different. This is a photo of the San Pedro River, which I showed from an aerial view a few slides ago. I am checking a camera here just so you have the scale of this border wall. These are big pieces of infrastructure. Some animals, like this bobcat, juvenile bobcat, are able to get through those 4-inch spaces. They're moving relatively freely despite this pieces of infrastructure. But other animals aren't moving. In this case, we are watching, and if there's a little bit of a lag on the internet, I apologize. In this case, we are seeing 2 adult mountain lions, a male and a female, approach the border wall, and they are unable to cross. This graphic, created by Victoria and the Frontieras magazine, shows crossing rates for some of the species we evaluated, where the silhouettes represent common animals. We have our bobcat, our turkey, our raccoon, badger, javelina, collared peccary, and then these numbers are the crossing rates. So important take home, most animals are crossing at really low rates, if at all. Our bigger animals like black bears, mountain lion, and deer completely excluded and unable to cross. As you get to the smaller animals like raccoons, they're crossing a little bit, a fair bit. Coyotes, it's like the teenagers can cross. The full, like bulky adults are unable to get through. And then we've seen just as many javelina get stuck in the wall as we've seen manage to squeeze through. So most medium to large mammals are blocked by the border wall. Now, I mentioned earlier we have hundreds and hundreds of miles of border wall. How many folks, again, not necessarily meant as a more of a rhetorical question, but how many folks think that there were accommodations for wildlife? How many people think that there were wildlife crossing structures, for example, considered or placed in the wall? Give you a minute to think about that. There were just a few. And so if anyone was thinking about a wildlife crossing structure, they do exist in the border, but this photo from the opening slide shows what they look like. This little hole here is all that is offered for wildlife along the length of the US-Mexico border where there is border wall. They are so small that we were fairly quick to dismiss them as a functional tool for wildlife. But the cameras tell a much different story. In fact, we have seen through our cameras that these are incredibly useful for some of the species in our region. On the left, we have a gray fox crossing through near Nogales. On the top right, we have a javelina traffic jam. We call it the 5 o'clock traffic, where these javelina are moving from Sonora into Arizona. They have to cross one at a time. So it creates this kind of mayhem. They're fun to watch behaviorally, but it also it just lets you know that this is a restrictive thing, that these animals have to cross one at a time, and it takes them sometimes like 20 minutes for a family group to get through. And then on the lower right, we have a coyote. So these are very useful for some species. Most surprising to us was seeing this. Where we have an adult female mountain lion crossing from Sonora into Arizona with her kittens, and she's able to use this wildlife opening that's right kind of here in the center of the frame. And then the kittens can fit through much easier than the adult. So this is hopeful. This is much better than we expected. It also reminds you that this is, again, like the javelina, is a very limiting structure where this adult female, has to spend quite a bit of time getting through that opening. So it's a good thing that she can. We wish they were a bit bigger. If we compare the crossing rate, so this is the same figure we saw before, and I want you to pay attention to the numbers kind of in this center area where we have 0 and 16 for the felines, 1.6 for javelina. And if we change this same figure to look at the crossing rates when we have a wildlife opening present, you see the magnitude of change where the crossing rates for bobcats more than double, mountain lions go up to more than 40%. Javelina, it's almost a 20-fold increase in the ability of these animals to cross. So these wildlife openings are really valuable for some of these animals. Again, they're not making any difference for deer or bear. They're much too small. And we find this helpful, and we've used this information to talk with DHS to kind of promote more of these openings. One of their main fears is that they will be exploited by people for either smuggling or for crossing. But in more than 8,000 camera days, where a camera day is just, if we have 5 cameras out for 10 days, that's 50 camera days. More than 8,000 camera days, we've seen no evidence of human use. So these openings are not a liability, but they are benefiting many species. We now know that these openings are too small for male mountain lions. We have more and more videos of adult male mountain lions trying and failing to get through. So the wall is filtering species, but also filtering individuals by size. So the impacts of this are going to be severe. By extension, jaguars are going to be unable to use these openings. They're broader than the mountain lions. We have not seen a jaguar try to cross through one of these openings, but if male mountain lions cannot cross, it's a safe inference that jaguars will be unable to cross as well. So we know these things work. There's just not very many of them. In our study area that includes 109 miles of border wall, like actual wall, there are only 40 of these openings. And you can see they are spatially clustered with a collection out west, another set near Nogales, large stretch with none, and then a few at the San Pedro River. So there's just not very many of them, and we need more. We've been advocating through various channels to include more. And in fact, our data that shows humans really aren't using them has been almost more helpful than the data showing that wildlife can use them. There's no agreements in full place, but DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and Border Patrol have expressed a willingness to consider more of these, but we have not seen any new openings yet. But one of the reasons for this study was to prove they work, figure out if people are using them, and that way we can advocate for more of these crossing structures. They're not the only option for improving connectivity in the borderlands. Along the length of the wall, there are hundreds of floodgates to accommodate the high flood season. In our area, it's kind of June to September. We get these big, powerful monsoon thunderstorms, which dump tons and tons of water. Trapper, I'm not sure if you experienced one in Mount Graham, but they move a lot of water. And if the wall didn't have gates, it would fall down. In fact, it happens every year that a piece of the wall gets knocked down by a flood. And so they put in these gates to allow for water to move, but they just don't open them very frequently. Or if they do, they still pile them up with vehicle barriers or razor wire so that it limits their utility for wildlife. But we have ready-made large wildlife crossing structures if we could reach a point where these would be open year-round. We know they work. For example, mountain lions are our through piece today, where a male or I don't know what sex that is, a mountain lion crosses through a floodgate in the Paria Mountains. We've seen all the species that can't get through the wildlife openings cross here: bears, both species of deer, mountain lion. So we know these floodgates work. And conversely, we know they don't work. This is that when they're closed. This is that same floodgate. This is an adult mountain lion, probably used to crossing here, unable to cross now that this gate has been closed, and it's been closed permanently. They'll likely open it during a big storm, but it will not be open much anymore. Our work has also found that if you give animals 1.5 inches, they can cross more easily through the border infrastructure. This photo is of a coyote squeezing through a gap in the border wall. Across these hundreds of miles, right, we started to notice that there were some anomalies, that the gaps weren't always consistently 4 inches, and that in some places, by sheer accident, they were just a little bit wider. And animals, in fact, it was watching the footprints of javelina that cued us into this. Animals are exploiting these incidental gaps in the wall. And so we've placed cameras out to understand kind of the threshold of gap widths, or the spaces between bollards, and how that changes crossing rates for wildlife. This figure shows on the vertical axis crossing rates, and on the horizontal axis the width between the posts. For javelina, which is shown in this figure, the magic number is 5.5 inches, or a little more than 13 centimeters. As soon as you get to this value, these animals are crossing at rates similar to, if not greater than, what we see at the small wildlife openings. And it's a very similar story for bobcats and coyotes. Both of these animals exploit these wider gaps to cross more frequently, more freely than they do at the wildlife openings in some cases. This is a very practical and consequential finding, where we could change the permeability of the border for many species, save millions of dollars in construction costs by reducing the amount of steel needed to build the wall, without compromising the security of the border, if that's the focus. We've told Border Patrol repeatedly, and they have always rejected this and just said it's impossible to accommodate this change, without explaining why. But we'll continue to ask for this and push for this as opportunities arise. And I'll just mention that this is all very relevant right now, looking at this photo of a white-tailed deer near the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge, because I showed that figure at the start. We have a lot of border wall, but just this past fall, the reconciliation bill included $47 billion to build more wall. Currently, they are planning to build more than 700 miles of primary wall, and the scary piece is that they're starting to build secondary walls. On the photo on the left, you see they're building 2 parallel walls. They're planning more than 600 miles of this double wall system. In Texas, they're building river barriers, and this 47 billion represents the single largest public works project in the history of the United States. Single largest, most expensive, that is. And it's public funded, building an infrastructure that's largely ineffective at stopping people, but tragically effective at stopping wildlife. So I'll show this figure again, where this was the status of border wall for our western states in 2025. As of now, these are the projects that have either been completed or initiated. We were at 70% of the border blocked by border wall. We're going to be well over 90 by 2028. Several of these stretches include the secondary barriers, which is seen here. This is in the Patagonia Mountains, not far from Tucson, which is designated as critical jaguar habitat, representing an area that has been occupied by jaguars since 2015. And there was no wall here until April of 2026, and this photo was taken 2 weeks ago. They are pushing this double wall system, which will dramatically reduce crossing rates for all species, even those that can fit through the regular gaps. Because in addition to navigating one wall, they're going to have to navigate this wide open empty space that is empty now, but will soon include security lighting. Sadly, they're starting to place more and more razor wire along the wall. This is my coworker measuring one of those wildlife openings we've been monitoring, and they placed razor wire right over it. And we know razor wire is brutal. There's been deaths of endangered peninsular bighorn sheep that get tangled in this wire. We have videos of black bears lacerated by the razor wire, and videos of deer getting temporarily tangled. So this is a piece of infrastructure that's new, relatively new, and is pretty detrimental to the wildlife all along the border, while doing very little to impede the flow of people. And speaking of people, They're building these walls, right? As the justification is that they're seeing lots and lots of people crossing the border and that we need to control the flow of immigration. Our cameras along the border tell a much different story than that, than the story that's told at the national level, where looking across the San Rafael Valley, which includes two major mountain ranges, the Huachucas and the Patagonias, if we compare the number of deer to people, I just want to show you a figure. So 44 deer per person seen on our cameras. Another way to imagine this is that we have about 60 cameras in this valley that includes the mountain ranges on either side. Over the time of this study, all 60 of those cameras combined see on average 5 people a month. Half of those people are law enforcement or hunters, meaning that maybe our cameras are seeing people moving, refugees, immigrants twice a month in this valley, yet they are spending well over $300 million to build a wall in this piece and 47 billion to build a wall across the greater border. So the wall is largely not justified, but it carries with it some significant impacts to the region. And it's not the only solution, right? We already have what they call the virtual wall in place, which is it used to be 532 surveillance towers, and now it's more. But these can see most of the border, if not all the border. And it was long considered, in fact, it was the official stance of the Border Patrol Union until 2016, that this technology was what was needed to secure the border and that border walls were a waste of taxpayer dollars. That narrative has changed. We're trying to push back on that, and we need your help to kind of raise awareness of this issue and push for some more sensible policies at the border. But it's going to be a long challenge. It's gonna get worse before it gets better. But I do think that we can make the case for more sensible border policy because the impacts of border walls across a continent are going to be severe and already are. For example, in northern Mexico, in Mexico, black bears are federally endangered. In Arizona and New Mexico, Trapper, maybe you encountered some on Mount Graham, we have a pretty robust and large population of black bears. And genetic studies, telemetry studies, camera trapping studies prove that these bears move back and forth quite regularly across the border. And it's the genetic studies that offer support that the populations in northern Sonora are supported by some of the kind of traveling bears from Arizona. And as we close off these pathways that these bears are taking, the population in Sonora may become more vulnerable to things like disease or hunting pressures or wildfire because the population is already quite small. And by limiting the flow of individuals, we're starting to alter the resiliency of populations. Similar situations play out for desert pronghorn, Sonoran pronghorn, and peninsular bighorn sheep to the west of us, where populations are spanning the border and border walls are impeding the flow, where each population then that's cut in half, and this is something beyond just border walls, but in wildlife connectivity in general, when you split populations and you isolate populations, each population half becomes more and more vulnerable to things like wildfire or disease or other pressures. Kind of in the opposite direction, we in southern Arizona and in New Mexico are fortunate enough to have jaguars on the landscape. These were largely present in Arizona, a little bit in California, all the way up into the Grand Canyon until the early 1900s when they were pushed out through hunting pressures and land use changes and things like that. But since the mid 2000s, we've been seeing them return. In fact, almost every year for the past 12, 13 years, we've had at least one Arizona known and documented in Arizona. And these jaguars are typically coming through these three corridors. Right now, we know of one jaguar known as Cinco that's traveling around a couple mountain ranges in the sort of southeast corner of the state. And that jaguar has been here at least since last May. But these jaguars are returning to what was once their historical range because conservation efforts in Sonora and in Mexico have been quite successful. But as we build these border walls, we will lose the opportunity to restore and recover the population of jaguar in Arizona and New Mexico unless changes are made. These are just two examples of the potential impacts of border walls. We know that they are stopping the movements of many species that are foundational to the ecosystems, like javelina and white-tailed deer and mule deer, which are prey species for these top predators. When we stop the movements of those animals, I think we're going to see a shift in populations and a change in the dynamics of the borderlands if we don't allow for more connectivity. We published the initial findings of this work in late 2024. This is an open access article. Find it just by typing USA-Mexico border wall if anyone wants to learn more about the technical details. And then this also just reminds just one other piece of the whole story is that more and more security lighting is going up along the border, which takes the impacts of the physical structure and expand it up and out, right? Whereas insects and birds might not be as affected currently. With lighting, you're going to see some impacts to migratory birds. Anything that moves or communicates at night is going to be impacted. No, this is a really heavy topic. There is some reasons for hope. Just how useful those small wildlife openings are, and if we can just get more of those installed, we'll start to make a difference, and then eventually there'll be a chance to hopefully change the narrative around the border and start changing the infrastructure to allow all the animals to move as they need to. So my closing message is to keep hope alive. This is the long fight. Talk to friends and family. What I think we need now is folks hearing and learning about the border who are outside of the borderlands. This is an issue that's largely national, but it affects heavily the local communities and wildlife. But it's people in DC making these decisions. So I think more folks need to hear that throughout the country, people are want a change and don't want to see such a continuation of these policies. We are a volunteer organization with lots of people helping us. You could donate to support our study if you have the ability, but otherwise, I think just talking and sharing the story with your friends and relatives and elected officials can really make a difference. I close with the message that despite the border's intent to divide and keep us separate, we and other organizations are finding ways to come together and carry conservation forward despite the situation. This is us celebrating our second of what are now fourth annual bio blitzes, where we meet at the border and we collect observations and we tell the story of this biodiverse landscape and come together to share stories and burritos sometimes through the gates and through the wall. But really appreciate all of your attendance. I really am grateful for the opportunity, and I think we do have some time for questions.
Eamon, thank you so much. It was an awesome presentation. I learned a lot, so thank
Great.
you. Appreciate y'all's work. Um, I will let Bryn or Nick kick us off with Q&A, and then I have a few if we run out. So
Okay.
go ahead, guys.
We got a question from Kate Ostrom. How long do you think it will take to see significant population changes for/across species once the wall is finished and the continent is closed off? You talked about black bear, but what about others? And what are some signs that things are not going great ecology-wise at the border that we're going to see?
It's a really great question about the time it may take to see some of these changes. And I think of the impacts of the border at three levels, where at the immediate level, we see the impacts at the individual. Like I showed those videos of mountain lions stopping at the wall. Through our cameras, we have evidence of individuals spending more than 15 hours pacing back and forth and back and forth, trying to find a way through, which is a significant cost to that animal, right? That's a lot of time and energy and stress that's going to reduce its overall fitness, its overall survival. It's kind of like us with construction in town, right? Like it might take you 5 minutes to get to the grocery store, but they decide to rip up the street and now you have to go all the way around and it takes you 10, 15 minutes. It's the same for these animals where they have known resources, the wall comes through, but unlike us, they don't have cars and the change permanent. So these animals are forever altered. through time, that kind of percolates over into the populations, where each population is a little bit less robust because individuals are not breeding as successfully. And then through time, and I think this is what unfortunately our grandkids and future generations will really see, is there will be genetic changes. There's evidence from other continents and other places where walls have been in place for longer that there are genetic shifts in populations that are separated by barriers. And this is true in road ecology as well, where simple roads are creating changes in the population structures. So hard to give you a precise number on like when we'll start to see changes, but we already know that there's losses of life, right, with animals dying in the structures, but there's also an increase in vehicle activity and construction activity pushing animals away. And a really important piece that I didn't mention is that border wall construction is really thirsty. Estimates from 2020, where they were able to monitor a couple wells, showed that the construction process used as many as 700,000 gallons per day to build and create concrete. So we're in a drought. We're in a we're in a really significant drought, and we're pulling out hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. We will see changes to the system for those reasons.
Awesome. We have another question from Diane. Diane asks, for the larger animals, could you have a section that only opens when it recognizes the mammal?
This is another really great point, and I think we do have to get creative in trying to solve the challenges of connectivity at the border wall. The question was whether or not we could have some sort of automated system that would open a gate with detection technology. I think that that's a possibility, right? They're already having to bring power out to power the security lights. I think we're a little bit away from that for now, because it's going to be noisy. It's going to scare the animals as it swings open. But I do think we have to keep these creative solutions in mind. In lieu or short of having an automatic gate that uses detection technology, I think it would be really easy to just open the gates year round. The Border Patrol has more money than almost any system. Like, they get $47 billion to build their wall, but their annual budget is already over $100 billion per year. So they have the resources to install technology or just keep people nearby. So there's definitely, it's getting animals through the wall is not impossible. We can find the ways to do it.
Awesome. We got another one here. Do you think that the 5 a.m. traffic jam that you mentioned is common because they know of that specific opening near where they're migrating or where they are originating from?
Another really great question, and I think it is just precisely that. In the case of javelina, collared peccary, they are a group, they're a kind of a herding species. They travel in groups, and so I showed on those maps that these wildlife openings are very few and far between. And so a family group probably only has one, if they're lucky, of these openings in their kind of home range. So when they're moving back and forth across the border, that's where they're crossing. A recommendation we've repeatedly given to Border Patrol is if you're already going to put an opening in a location, could you put 2 or 3 in sequence so that these animals have a greater ability to cross? And it doesn't take them quite so long to move as a family group back and forth. But that's, yes, exactly. It's a pinch point, bottleneck.
We have another question. How sympathetic are politicians in Arizona and New Mexico?
It's a great question about how sympathetic politicians are. The border is a pretty controversial topic, and it has been for decades. And politicians are generally pretty cautious and careful about the way they say things because they don't want to be painted as weak or soft, right? It's just the reality. There are a number of local politicians in both states that have recognized border walls are not the solution. We haven't yet found one who's very, very vocal about it, but there's more and more people may be aware of the situation in Texas where they're pushing wall through Big Bend and most of Texas, right? But Big Bend has really garnered a lot of support for stopping or not allowing the wall through because it's such a unique area. And there are some more folks, politicians and other recognized public figures that are speaking out vocally against the border wall. And I think that's starting to help. Unfortunately, in Arizona, New Mexico, California, that ship's a little bit sailed or we're a little bit late. But these projects could be stopped. They've built many, many miles, but they don't need to keep building. So we're hoping to find more and more voices. And I think what may help change this is if people start hearing about it from other states, not just the kind of local handful of senators and representatives in the borderlands.
I guess kind of on a similar theme here, Mia is asking, where do you source funding to help support the issue?
Great question, Mia. Funding comes from a variety of sources. I mean, we have volunteer or individual donations. We have private foundations that support our work. It's a great cue to bring up the next slide. Wilbur Foundation is a really big supporter. The National Park Service actually has funded us for quite a few years. And then a few other small grants here and there at the state and county level. But it's a hodgepodge of funding that comes from individual donations and grant opportunities.
We have two questions that are about water. One,
Okay.
what happens when water is on only one side and animals cannot access it? And then also, what are the impacts of rivers being dammed by the wall?
Yeah, water is a big one and poorly understood the whole implications to the aquifer and the hydrology of the borderlands of this border wall because there's the physical structure we see, and then they cut 10 to 12-foot trenches and fill that with concrete as an anti-dig feature. So that's where a lot of the water consumption comes from, but that is also going to impede the movement of water. So when an animal can't access water because they can't get through the wall, it adds to the stress and the cost that animal pays to exist. It increases its cost of living, basically, where it has to travel farther or compete for limited resources. And water is a pretty limited resource in the desert where times of year it's abundant. The monsoon season, if we have a good rainy season, there's water everywhere. But the other 8, 9 months of the year, water is fairly limited. And so these animals need to move freely to access the water. And without that, there will be cost, there will be loss, there will be mortality. And then the second part of this question, if I remember, was about the impacts of damming the rivers. And these are desert rivers that are flowing year round, but not always visible on the surface. Sometimes it's subterranean flows. In the case of the San Pedro River, the hydrology has changed and the groundwater has fallen on the north side of the wall. It's a north flowing river, and that structure is impacting the depth of the water table. We are just now witnessing, as of like the last couple of weeks, honestly, them damming another river, the Santa Cruz. And a part of that is surface flow year round. And I really don't know what's going to happen with that river as they dam it. Water can still get through, but debris builds up and then it slows the flow of water and it changes the hydrology around the border. It's a big question that we'll probably be paying for and learning about for decades.
All right, one more on water. Will the rust from the wall have an impact on available water, or does it already?
Oh, brilliant. You guys have really thoughtful questions. It's actually something I've been pondering. What is the impact of having a massive structure that's rusting and leaking iron oxide into the systems and other products of rust? I don't have a good answer for that, and I think we've pondered it and reached out to some hydrologists, but I think it's something that warrants more research. There's an effort, and if you remember from the photo when I showed the two walls, they're painting the new wall black. There's a lot of media coverage around that, but they have their own reasons for doing it. But one thing that I think is an unintended consequence is it might actually protect the rust. It might actually hold more of the rust in. So I'm not glad that they're painting it, but part of me is kind of thinking that, well, maybe this is actually going to be slightly less impactful. But that is a really big question. I don't know and needs to be studied.
There's another, how involved is the Mexican government or the Mexican states that are along the border?
So I mentioned it's a great question of how involved the Mexican government and political entities are with the border story. I mentioned that a lot of these decisions at the border are made by people in Washington, D.C., which is, more than 1,000 miles away. the border is more than 1,000 miles away from Mexico City, which is the political hub. So there's been this kind of tradition of the border wall as the US problem, and we're just going to leave it there. But we work with a lot of nonprofit organizations. We work with a lot of landowners along the border, and we work increasingly with the Forest Service, the analog in Mexico. And there's more interest in changing the story or finding alternatives or at least expressions of dismay that this is happening. And so it's a really tough issue. The U.S. plays the bully here and doesn't really give Mexico much space. But I think that's starting to change as just the recognition of just the scale of this, and the impacts to water, right? Like we have international treaties that prohibit the blocking of rivers and the blocking of water, and yet the border wall is doing that. And so I think there will be some more communication and more conversations about it.
All great questions. Thanks everyone for providing really thoughtful questions and testing Eamon tonight. Eamon, thank you so much. I did want to ask one. I didn't know about the floodgates, so that was really interesting, and I appreciate that. And so couple thoughts I had is, or questions I had is, you know, while you all are out setting these cameras and monitoring things on the ground, are y'all seeing, and you may have covered this and I just missed it, but are y'all seeing a lot of mortality of, smaller species, reptiles, amphibians from just the traffic associated with, I guess, policing the border wall?
Yeah, so that hits on a really important point that I focused a lot today on the physical structure of the border wall, but that's just a small piece of the story, right? There's the lighting. You'll see in these photos that it's a minimum of like a 50-foot enforcement zone where they bulldoze it and they grade it, and they literally rake the roads almost every day to track for footprints. And so there are lots of consequences of just all that extra vehicle traffic. And then there's this proliferation of invasive plant species along the border. So the impacts of the border are complicated, right? There's many of them. We do see some roadkill. I can tell you from our cameras that as you have more vehicle activity, we have fewer animals using the border road or crossing, right? That as you have more daily vehicle activity, you have fewer animals even bothering to try to cross. And yeah, observations of dead bobcats, dead snakes, dead skunks, dead foxes, dead deer, we see that. I don't have an objective number to tell you we think that it's X per mile or things like that, but it's definitely happening that all of that extra activity is causing mortality. And ironically, we see a lot more Border Patrol activity where there is wall than where there isn't wall. And a repeated message I talk to a lot of Border Patrol agents when I'm out there. Many times, Border Patrol agents have told me, man, all we wanted was a better road. The wall doesn't work. We don't want the wall. We just wanted better roads. But that they are also expressing a frustration that they're not listened to. The decisions are made above their head. But that was a long-winded answer to your question.
No, I appreciate that. And I mean, it sounds like that, at least some of the agents you're running into on the ground are willing to have these conversations. And it seems like the border, I guess the folks that are that you're interacting with are at least open to having conversations and taking suggestions, which is you know really good to hear that at least they're willing to have the conversation. Now, whether they're able or willing to act upon those,
Mhm.
entirely different. But it's good to hear that they're at least willing to sit down and have a conversation. So that's encouraging. Those uh, those original small openings, what what was the purpose of those in the beginning? Did
Yeah. Yeah. And so just quickly on your last comment, a lot of agents who are willing to talk to me, and when I tell them, well, don't tell me this, tell your bosses that, they say, oh, we can't. But I do agree. I'm grateful that some of them are willing to hear this and value compromise with this small opening. So we call them small wildlife openings. Border Patrol will call them cat doors because their original purpose was for the ocelot population in southeast Texas. So the border wall goes through Laguna Atascosa National Wildlife Refuge and several other national wildlife refuges and important properties for the endangered ocelot that is breeding in Texas. We have ocelots in Arizona as well, but just lone males come up from Mexico and we don't. They were extirpated much like jaguars. But as the wall was pushing through some of those national wildlife refuges in Texas, there was a realization that, or a concession that something needed to be done to allow the cats through. So that's where they got the name cats. No one has given me a great answer on where the size came from. It's 8.5 inches wide by 11 inches tall. So they're the size of a piece of binder paper. And they're very firm on that. They're unwilling to consider even an extra centimeter. And the kind of rumor I've heard is that someone just walked into that initial meeting with a piece of paper and was like, this is what you get. And that's what we have. But again, they're better than nothing. We just want more of them. And hopefully that can happen.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, and I want to be respectful of your time. I know we're just over. So, yeah, I think I can speak on everyone's behalf and appreciating you speaking to us tonight and how much I learned. So hopefully others learned a lot too. And Eamon, I will be following up.
Yeah.
I'd love to just talk to you a little bit more about what all you have going on down there, especially some of the camera trap protocols for the citizen science part of the
Yeah.
study. I think we could probably learn from some of your protocols, but again, just wanted to say thank you so much, and please don't hesitate to reach back out to us. And thank you everyone for joining that was able to join, and we'll be following up with some materials and certainly the recording. That way you can share this around. And like Eamon said, I think what I took away is the biggest thing we can do if you're not in the Southwest is spread this message. And I mean, talk to your politicians, talk to your neighbors about some of these solutions and best management practices that Eamon mentioned. So that can really go a long way. So we appreciate having you. Everyone, have a good
Yeah.
night.
Thank you all. My email's here. You'll also get it in a follow-up email. Feel free to reach out with questions. Thank you all so much for your time.
Have a good night. Thank you, Eamon.
Bye.